Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
You are listening to Mortification of Spin. My name is Todd Pruitt. I'm the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I'm joined as always by my friend Carl Trueman, a professor at Grove City College. And today we're going to continue the conversation that I was having with Carl about his new book, The Desecration of Man. This is a program that we recorded over 2 sessions. And so we just pick up midway through the conversation that Carl and I were having. Hope you enjoy this.
Well, I think it's becoming patently obvious that the revolutions of modernity, for want of a better phrase, have proved in the long run to be fundamentally dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. And because we are human beings, because we're made in the image of God, we, at least most of us, intuitively grasp that there's something amiss in that. Very, very few people, short of psychopaths that you meet, have no moral compass. We may disagree on the details of morality, but by and large, there's a sense in which we understand that other human beings are to be treated as persons, not things. Yeah. How do we ground that? Well, ultimately, I think you have to ground that in a notion that human beings are made in the image of God.
Carl, unpack that a little, because your first chapter in the book is really dedicated to that theme. And over the years, I grew up in the church, and so I've heard the notion of the image of God explained in different ways, sometimes in ways that are not at all convincing, other times in very, very, what I would say are very good, biblically well-reasoned ways. But I still find when I have conversations with Christians that there's either just very vague ideas of what that can mean, all the way to just being bad ideas of what it can mean. But what are we talking about? Historically, what has the church affirmed about what it means to be made in the image of God?
Yeah, I mean, the church has affirmed various aspects of that. I think one aspect of it be that we are rational creatures. Mm-hmm. That means that we have a process of thinking about our actions. I would use an example of, if you think about a beaver, for example, or maybe better example, a fox. Mm-hmm. If you put a fox in the presence of a chicken, the fox is going to kill the chicken. Right. It may think about it, but it's not going to think about it in the way that a human being does. We are going to look at the chicken. We're going to project an image of the future. We're going to think about the utility of killing or keeping the chicken alive. Mm-hmm. And we're going to freely act in relation to the chicken relative to conclusions we draw because of that. We're rational and we are free creatures. So that would be one aspect of the image of God. There's a freedom to being a human being. Mm-hmm. Secondly, though, there's a relational aspect to it as well, that as human beings, we don't want to exist in isolation. I would put it this way in class. I say, we want to belong. That a lot of our sense of self-worth, our reflection upon ourselves, depends upon how other people treat us. If I got a letter in the post saying that the King of England was going to knight me, I'd feel pretty good about myself. Why? Because such an important person had acknowledged my existence and wanted to honor me. Right. And that plays out in a small way in our everyday lives. The love of a man for his wife and of a wife for a husband. The love of children for their parents and parents for their kids. The love of friends for each other. All of these things play into making us feel we're valued and we belong. And that's an important part of what it means to be a human being. The problem, of course, is that it can be difficult to tie those two things together. To be free and to belong, that's not an easy thing to do, because to belong is to surrender some of our freedom. Think about marriage. When you marry somebody else, you surrender some of your freedom. Hey, you marry the girl, you
Right.
can no longer date other girls. You're less free than you once were. And the question is, how do we tie those two things together? And I think in modernity, what we've done is we've emphasized freedom at the expense of belonging. We have come up
Yeah.
with a philosophy of what it means to be human that emphasizes, if you like, that first part of the image, our freedom,
Mhm.
at the expense of our belonging, at the expense of our obligations and dependencies. Ultimately, we've emphasized that freedom to the point where we don't even see ourselves as obliged or dependent upon God. So
Mhm.
that emphasis on the image of God becomes paradoxically a kind of repudiation of the image of God in that sense. And some of what we're seeing today politically, just as an aside, is a kind of massive reaction against that. We're beginning to see a reaction against freedom and an
Mhm.
overemphasis upon belonging. That communitarianism of various kinds, identity politics being the most obvious example in the West,
Yeah.
is emerging as a response to the radical individualism of times past. What I would want to argue is that freedom and belonging are beautifully united when we understand ourselves as made in the image of God and redeemed in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's where the great human dilemma, how can I be free? How can I belong? That's where the great human dilemma is resolved. And it's resolved in the church, the proclamation of the gospel, the corporate worship, the living in community. This is where we find what it truly means to be free and to belong.
Mhm. And that these things, as image bearers of God, they belong to us, irrespective of um, our physical abilities or our intellectual abilities, that there is a value and a dignity to that life. So, for instance, Peter Singer, who of course you're familiar with, a longtime Princeton philosopher, has justified what he's called, postnatal abortions on, infants, et cetera, is that the human is not a person until he or she understands things like the network of relationships it's involved in. So until it's at a place where it can contribute to a community of relationships, that human is not a person yet. And therefore, he's able to justify those things. And so it's a very utilitarian approach
Oh,
to the
yes.
value
Yeah.
of human life, which is very different from the Christian understanding of human dignity, which is not
Yeah.
utilitarian.
No, not at all. That all creatures, all human beings are made in the image of God and are therefore of equal value
Yeah.
before God. And of course, one of the things we're seeing in our current climate is that an intensification in some ways of the Singer type philosophy.
Yeah.
Because one of the arguments I make in the book is that particularly reproductive technology is beginning to reshape what we expect children to be.
Right.
Gene editing, I would say prenatal
Yeah.
gene editing, uh, screening, embryonic
Mhm.
screening, uh, even, and this is something actually I've been thinking about since I completed the book, but the emergence of machines and computers as normative for what it means to be human beings, as
Right.
opposed to actual human beings. All of these things are driving us towards a way of thinking about human beings that sees limits as imperfections.
Right.
And so,
Right.
we're already in the situation where, Iceland boasts that it
Hmm.
has more or less eliminated Down syndrome.
Yeah.
What it means, of course, is that it's eliminated humans with Down
Right.
syndrome. It finds them early and it destroys them.
Right.
Uh, but that's going to become more and more normative. We're seeing
Hmm.
with the rise of medically assisted dying, places like Canada, parts of Europe, it's coming to the United States. Uh, the idea of what the good life should be, and if you
Hmm.
don't conform to it, do you deserve to continue?
Right.
These are big pressing questions. And I say,
Yeah.
and when you've lost sight of human beings as made in the image of God, you lose any kind of anchor that allows you to think about those questions in a way that I would regard as humane and humanizing.
Right.
Again, this promises liberation,
Yeah.
but actually delivers a degradation of what it
Mhm.
means to be human.
And and that means, among other things, that Christians are going to have to be very thoughtful about how they approach the the idea of conception.
Yeah,
And I'm asked periodically about, for instance, in vitro fertilization,
yeah,
because in IVF, the typical process is that multiple eggs are fertilized, and then only, one of those fertilized eggs would be implanted, maybe two, and the others either destroyed or frozen.
yeah,
And if we're going to be consistent in our understanding that what Scripture tells us about human life, that it begins at conception, we're going to say that and be consistent with that, then we have to ask, questions about things like IVF and conception. And pastorally, it's challenging because when you have a young
yeah,
couple looking at you saying, Pastor, can we do this? And you see a young couple, they want so much to have a baby. You look at them and you say, they'd be great parents.
yeah,
And they want a baby for great reasons, all the great reasons why someone wants to have children. And it's a hard thing then to tell them gently but clearly, well, whatever option destroys, deliberately. We understand that things happen, quote,
yeah,
naturally, but whatever option deliberately destroys fertilized eggs, that's a human embryo, that's a life, then we need to reject that. That's hard. And I think one of the reasons it's hard is, first of all, because it's good to want a child. And so it should be hard.
yes. You
And it
desire
should
this young couple are desiring something good. It's not like
absolutely.
wanting an abortion. It's
That's
it's
right.
a
They're
desire
not
for
asking for a
something good.
Corvette. They're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
asking for a Corvette. They're asking to be
yeah.
parents and to raise
Very
children. So
natural desire that we want to
exactly,
affirm.
that's a good thing. You affirm that, and you also, though, do have to say, in a fallen world, sometimes some of us can't have that in that way. Now
Yeah,
there are things like adoption, that sort of thing. I don't know if those are complexities. I know that those are hard answers, but pastors are going to need to help their people understand some of that, and that's why, it's where you need the fellowship. The church, you might have to, this couple needs
yeah,
to walk through folks that have had maybe similar pain or haven't, but at least are their faithful brothers and sisters in Christ, because that's a hard thing. And sometimes all we can do is say, I know there's technology that can get me there, but I don't think the technology's right. And we have to be
yeah.
willing to say that.
Yeah, I anticipate that the chapter in my book that will upset people will be the chapter
Mhm.
entitled "What Does It Mean to Be Human in an Age of Mechanical Reproduction?"
Yeah,
Because my take is that IVF and surrogacy really shift the way society thinks about reproduction and particularly children. And I've got
right.
to be careful here. Uh, because I certainly don't want to deny the humanity of anybody born via IVF
Absolutely.
or surrogacy. That's not what I'm doing.
Absolutely.
But I take a particularly hard line approach in some
Mhm.
ways, in that to me, it's even if you could have just the one embryo fertilized, I'd
Mhm.
still say there are problems with that process.
Yeah.
And one of the problems is this: the law is pushed more and more towards treating human beings as pieces of property.
Right.
My response to those who challenge me is saying, are you saying that children born by IVF are not human beings? I would say, no, I think they're human beings. My
Absolutely.
concern is that the law has to treat them as less than human beings.
Yes.
And I wrote about this at First Things recently, and I had an email. I was expecting some very hostile emails, but I didn't get a. I actually had an email from a gentleman who said, my wife and I have adopted some embryos I guess the sort of snowflake baby kind of thing, he
Yep.
said. And he was actually criticizing me for not going far enough in this article.
Wow.
And I used the language, I said, the law has to treat children as analogous to pieces of
Yeah.
property.
Yeah.
And he corrected me and he said, no, it's not analogous to pieces of property.
Yeah.
They are pieces of property. He said, you should have seen the contract I had to sign. When my wife and I adopted these embryos, they were pieces of property.
Yeah.
And my concern there is that is the law upstream or downstream of culture? Well, it's a bit of both. But the bottom line is the more normative IVF and surrogacy become in society, the more normal it will be to think of children as property, and the more normal it will become to think of the relationship between parents and children as one that's defined by law, not by nature. And my fear is that a lot of, particularly Protestant pastors, faced with this issue, won't really know even how to begin thinking it through. You don't have to agree with me, but you do have to think it through.
Right.
And that's where I think, a full-blooded anthropology that understands the significance of human beings as physically embodied and the importance of the physical relationship between parents and children is important. I always remember Mary Harrington. I think she said this when we interviewed her. It's certainly in her book. She sort of flipped the standard feminist argument about babies in the womb on its head and said,
Yes.
I can never get over thinking of my daughter as part of my body. And then she flips it, says, and that's why I'm committed to caring for her. If I care for my hands or my feet or my face, 40 hori, I'm going to care for my daughter. And it was a classic piece of Mary provocative logic that just makes you sit back and pay attention and perhaps laugh a little. But she really nailed something there.
I remember when she said that in our interview. I'd never heard it that way, heard it explained that way. But then you think about, what's the command to love our neighbor? Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
No man, no man neglects himself, and does but you feed it and you care for it. And that's how you ought to love your wife, husbands. That's how you ought to love your neighbor, Christians, as though they're, in a sense, as though they're a part of you.
Yeah.
And, that was, I still remember how she flipped that in a really profound, very, very helpful way. Carl, in terms of the technology, what happens when they're able to successfully implant a womb inside of a male body?
Well,
because they're wanting this really bad. They're wanting this really bad.
To quote Sir Walter Scott's famous line, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And I would say that applies to, we are allowing technology to run ahead of itself without any moral breaks or controls at all. And I've said this before, it's one of my big concerns about the current administration. I'm neither a Donald Trump fanboy nor a Donald Trump mega critic. I'm a sort of cynical, hey, whoever's in charge, there's good and there's bad. I would say one of the most concerning things about our current state of affairs is that the so-called tech bros seem to be getting more freedom than perhaps one would like. And I've used Elon Musk as an example. I'm very, very grateful. Despite the personal tragedy involved, very grateful for the way that Elon Musk was instrumental in getting some very good focus on and legislation relative to the transgender question. Yes. Very sad for the personal circumstances that made this a thing for him, but very grateful for the impulse and the influence that he had there. On the other hand, he's a transhumanist, and that larger problem is still there.
Exactly. So, and he doesn't see it yet, which I assume he just can't see it yet. which is interesting.
We need to pray. We need to pray for that. I was struck a few years ago chatting to a friend, actually not a Christian friend, but a religious leader who was invited to a summit that Pope Francis had called at the Vatican to get religious leaders, moral philosophers, and Silicon Valley gurus talking together, and commented that the tech bros talked on day one, the moral philosophers and theologians talked on day two. On day two, all the tech bros had already gone home. They're not interested in providing a moral framework. And I would say that's why anthropology is so critical. If you don't have an understanding of what it means to be a human being, then you're going to have the sky is the limit. What technology can do has to be good. And if you can implant a womb in a man, or to raise another acute point, Todd, what about when we can produce human beings simply from skin cells?
Right.
Is the person produced from skin cells a human being?
Right.
Do they bear the image of God?
Yeah.
These are, I would say, from my finite, dim-witted perspective, imponderables for me at this particular point in time. But I fear that they're going to be pressing challenges before I die. They're coming fast and furious at us. And that's why I think having some sort of normative anthropology in place is going to be critical. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to get people's minds focused on the issue of anthropology. 4th, 5th century, it's doctrine of God and Christology. 16th century, it's sacraments and authority. Big challenge for the church, all the churches today, is what does it mean to be a human being? And if we just allow the possibilities of technology to define that for us, we will have no way of giving sound biblical Christian answers to these challenges.
And so what would you counsel, let's say you're sitting at a round table with pastors and you're taking them through this material, and then before you let them go, you say, pastors, here are a handful of things. Here are a few things I really hope you'll do in your ministry at the church. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, I think in the last chapter I deal with how do we consecrate human beings. One of the things I say is, first of all, we've got to teach. There has to be good teaching. It has to be the whole counsel of God. But as in the early church, as in the 4th, 5th century, as in the 16th century, we teach the whole counsel of God, but we also bear in mind where the pressure, where the challenges are coming from. And so when you're teaching the whole counsel of God, be aware that you have to constantly be connecting the dots to the big issue of the day. Right. So if you're teaching on creation, I would say at this particular point in time, perhaps if you're teaching on Genesis 1 and 2, 624 hours. The debates about the time of creation, they are important, but they're not the most important thing for most people. For most people, the question of what does it mean to be a human being made in the image of God, that's going to be the most important thing.
Right. Because they have a son right now who thinks he's a girl.
Yeah, their son isn't wrestling with, is it 624, 24-hour days? Am I a girl? When you're thinking about the resurrection, thinking about the gospel, say, think about the resurrection. Think about the implications of the resurrection for who we are as human beings, that we're not simply souls. We're body and soul. That would be one connection. So make sure your teaching is solid. I would also say worship. Worship has to reinforce the idea that we are bodies and that we are bodies that stand in relation to other bodies. So for me, during COVID, online worship as it was perhaps better than nothing. And maybe today, for those who are shut in, it's okay to stream your services. My preference would be to make sure it's password coded so only legitimate stay-at-homes can get access to it. But really, being with the people of God on a Sunday, standing next to shoulder to shoulder with people, can't be replaced. And that has all kinds of interesting benefits, not least, I cited the book, some interesting research that's been done on corporate singing. Merely engaging in corporate singing apparently gives you a broader view of what it means to be a human being.
Wow.
It makes you more likely to listen to other people, to understand your relationship of obligation and dependency towards them. So make sure your worship is embodied, and make sure that your worship too reinforces the gospel message. Have a liturgy that reflects the rhythm of the gospel. And then thirdly, don't neglect hospitality. We've had Rosaria, of course, on here several times. Rosaria is the guru on hospitality. But what is hospitality? It's embodied, it's kind and generous, embodied interaction with other people that reflects the fact that we are not islands, that we exist in relationship to others. So emphasize hospitality as well. So those are the things that I would suggest pastors do. In terms of their own private reading, obviously buy my book. That's the most important
Of course.
thing. But seriously, I would say read some of the great stuff written on the theology of the body. The classic stuff, of course, tends to be Roman Catholic. It's John Paul II, etc. But what we've seen over the last few years is an increasing number of Protestants starting to reflect on the importance of the body. So if you're worried about recommending a Catholic author to your congregation, you feel that would be a roadblock to them or disturb them, check out what's been written in Protestantism on the importance of the body for what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, I tell people to get John Kleinig's book that's published by Lexham Press, wonderfully made. It is an excellent biblical anthropology from a classic Protestant perspective. That's one great example.
Kleinig would probably be the best place for your Protestant pastor who wants some orientation start. I would also reckon he is a Roman Catholic, but the book is written in a very generically Christian way. I would recommend Christopher West's Our Bodies Tell God's Story, which is an excellent volume.
Yes.
And that's at a Sunday school level. Now, again, you may not want to recommend a book by Catholic, just Sunday school. It might disturb some.
But if you're a pastor, read some of these things, and then you can adapt it in your teaching and preaching, and
Christopher West, and there's also the Theology of the Body Evangelization Project. It's a Roman Catholic group, but it's actually funded by a Baptist group, would you believe? And so myself, Andrew Walker at Southern Seminary, we've done videos for them because I believe part of the condition of the gift was you got to have Protestants involved. Some excellent videos they've done for elementary school, middle school, high school kids on these issues, age-appropriate levels. There are resources out there on embodiment that you can find that are appropriate for use with young Protestant evangelical people.
Well, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I want to encourage our listeners to get a hold of a copy of Carl's new book, The Desecration of Man: How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. It's an important new book. It's going to be widely read and discussed. If you would like to enter to win a free copy, you can go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you can enter to win a copy of this book. And if while you're there, you'd like to make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can certainly do that, and I know it would be appreciated. Thank you all for joining us. And hope this has been helpful. It's been encouraging for me. Pass it along to other folks, encourage them to give it a listen, and we'll look forward to being with you next time on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.